Hey guys, tonight we're going to dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and ease into a journey back to the 19th century in America. Imagine a time when gas lamps flickered in cobblestone streets, horse-drawn carriages rattled by, and life, for most, was profoundly different from our own. We're not talking about grand adventures or heroic battles tonight. Instead, we're going to delve into a much darker, more unsettling corner of history. A world that existed just beneath the surface of polite society, the disturbing realm of the Body Snatchers. Picture a quiet, moonlit cemetery in, say, a sprawling city like New York or a bustling hub like Philadelphia. The air is still. Perhaps a faint mist hangs low over the weathered gravestones, each marking a life laid to rest. The only sounds are the distant chimes of a church clock and the rustle of leaves in the breeze. But this peace, this sacred quiet, is often an illusion. For beneath the soil, beneath the carefully placed headstones, a grim and utterly illicit trade was taking place. A trade so macabre, so chilling, that it preyed on the deepest fears of ordinary people. Seriously, you wouldn't want to live back then. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're listening from somewhere amazing, let me know your location and local time in the comments now. Let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're a resident of Boston, a bustling port city in the mid-1800s. Life moves at a different pace, dictated by the rhythm of the tides and the clamor of commerce. For most, the day ends with the setting sun, and the night brings a fragile peace. But for some, the night is when the real work begins. Your story, like so many others, is about to be touched by the unseen, by the chilling reality that even after death, your body might not truly be at rest. In this era, the medical landscape was undergoing a profound transformation. Universities like Harvard Medical School in Boston, or the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia, were burgeoning centers of medical learning. Doctors and anatomists, eager to unlock the secrets of the human body, were pushing the boundaries of scientific inquiry. They understood that to truly understand disease, to perform life-saving surgeries, they needed direct access to human cadavers for dissection and study. This was the only way to gain practical knowledge of anatomy, the foundational pillar of all medical practice. However, there was a monumental problem. The legal supply of cadavers was virtually non-existent. Laws were strict, often only allowing the dissection of executed criminals. And even then, the supply was woefully inadequate for the growing number of medical students. Demand far outstripped supply, creating a vacuum that was quickly filled by a shadowy, morally ambiguous profession, the Body Snatchers, often euphemistically called resurrection men, or ghouls. These were individuals, often from the fringes of society, who made their living by digging up recently buried corpses and selling them to medical institutions. Imagine you're a young medical student at a respectable institution. Your professors speak of the vital need for anatomical study, lamenting the scarcity of cadavers. You see diagrams and sketches, but the reality of a human body, its intricate network of muscles, nerves, and organs, remains a theoretical concept. The dissecting rooms, when they do receive a body, are scenes of intense, almost frenzied activity, with dozens of students clamoring for a glimpse, a touch, a moment to truly learn. The pressure to gain practical experience is immense, and it creates a demand for bodies that the legal system simply cannot meet. This ethical tightrope, the urgent scientific need versus the profound moral implications of desecrating graves, was a defining dilemma of 19th century medicine. You hear hushed conversations among your fellow students about deliveries made under the cloak of darkness. No one speaks openly of where the cadavers come from, but everyone knows. You occasionally catch a glimpse of a rough-looking cart arriving late at night, pulling up to a discreet side entrance of the medical college. You see shadowy figures quickly unloading what appears to be a large, oddly shaped sack or a roughly constructed wooden box. The smell of disinfectant and something else, something vaguely earthy and unsettling, wafts from the direction of the dissecting rooms after these late-night arrivals. A common historical fact is that medical schools throughout the United States and Europe in the 18th and 19th centuries relied heavily on illegal cadavers for anatomical dissection. Without a reliable legal source, grave robbing became an unfortunate yet essential part of medical education. This reliance underscores the nascent stage of medical science, where direct observation was paramount. One evening, unable to sleep, you decide to walk by the medical college, just observing. You see a figure lurking in the shadows near the back gate, smoking a pipe. He's a burly man, dressed in rough, dark clothing, his face half hidden by a wide-brimmed hat. He's known around the university as Old Silas, a character rumored to be one of the primary suppliers of anatomical material. His presence sends a shiver down your spine. He's a direct link to the macabre trade, a living embodiment of the desperation that drove it. You try to imagine his life, his motivations, and the profound moral compromise he makes with every stolen body. A particularly disturbing, yet common, practice was the snatching of bodies from paupers' graves or cemeteries associated with almshouses. These individuals, often poor or without family, were considered less likely to have their graves protected or their disappearance reported. It was a cruel irony even in death. The poor remained vulnerable, their bodies serving a purpose they could never have afforded in life. This exploitation highlighted the vast class disparities of the era and the callous disregard for human dignity in the pursuit of scientific knowledge. You might hear whispers about specific cemeteries being easier targets. Small, rural graveyards, with fewer caretakers and less public traffic, were prime locations, or newly dug graves where the earth was still loose and easily disturbed. The Body Snatchers operated with chilling efficiency, knowing exactly how to minimize their time at the site and how to avoid detection. They preferred fresh graves, as the bodies were in better condition for dissection. Historians still debate the true motivations of the Body Snatchers themselves. Were they simply desperate individuals trying to make a living in a harsh economy? Or were some driven by a perverse thrill in their macabre work? While financial gain was undoubtedly a primary driver, the willingness to desecrate graves and traffic in human remains suggests a desensitization that many find disturbing. One dark night, a chilling incident occurs that brings the reality of body snatching terrifyingly close to home. The local newspaper, usually filled with mundane news of shipping arrivals and social events, carries a sensational headline: Graves desecrated family outraged at cemetery robbery. The report details how the grave of a prominent Bostonian, recently deceased, was found disturbed. The coffin was unearthed, pried open, and the body gone. The family, heartbroken and furious, offered a reward for information, but the culprits vanished without a trace. The city buzzes with fear and outrage. People begin to visit cemeteries, checking on the graves of their loved ones, their faces pale with anxiety. You see men walking with lanterns in the dead of night, guarding family plots. The silent terror of the grave robber becomes a palpable fear, a chilling reminder that even the sanctity of death is not guaranteed. This incident, and others like it, underscore the profound societal conflict. On one hand, the rapidly advancing medical science held the promise of saving lives and alleviating suffering. On the other, the methods used to acquire the necessary knowledge violated deeply held religious beliefs and cultural norms surrounding death and burial. The public's outcry grew louder with each reported desecration, putting immense pressure on medical institutions and authorities to find a solution. The disturbing world of the Body Snatchers, while a dark chapter, has forced society to confront fundamental questions about the value of scientific progress versus the sanctity of the human body and the peace of the grave. And as you try to drift off to sleep tonight, you can almost hear the faint scrape of shovels on distant earth, a reminder of the unsettling truth that once you were laid to rest, your journey might not truly be over. The desperate need for fresh cadavers by burgeoning medical schools wasn't merely an academic concern. It was a driving force behind a truly macabre industry. As a medical student in, let's say, Philadelphia in the 1830s, you'd feel the intense pressure. The city was a hub of medical innovation, with institutions like the University of Pennsylvania and Jefferson Medical College attracting ambitious young minds eager to learn. Yet, the very foundation of their education, anatomical dissection, was built on a shaky, ethically fraught premise. Imagine yourself in the dissecting room. The air is thick with the smell of preservatives, and perhaps a faint metallic tang. Dozens of students, each paying a hefty fee for the privilege, crowd around a single cadaver. You strain to see, to absorb every detail as the professor, a renowned anatomist, meticulously points out muscles, nerves, and organs. This isn't theoretical knowledge from a textbook. It's hands-on, visceral learning, absolutely essential for any aspiring surgeon or physician. But the scarcity is agonizing. A single body might serve a dozen or more students, limiting individual practice and forcing rushed observations. The demand for more bodies, fresh bodies, became an urgent, almost desperate plea from the academic world. Legally, the sources were pitifully few. State laws often restricted the use of cadavers to only the bodies of executed criminals. And in a time when executions were relatively rare, this trickle was nowhere near enough to meet the demand of hundreds, even thousands of medical students across the nation. This created a profound ethical dilemma for medical professionals. They genuinely believed that anatomical study was crucial for advancing medicine, for saving lives, for understanding disease. Yet, the only reliable way to obtain the necessary material was through illegal and deeply immoral means, grave robbing. This moral tightrope was constantly walked, often rationalized by the greater good of medical progress. You might hear professors lamenting the state of affairs, speaking in hushed tones about the unfortunate necessity of certain arrangements. No one openly admitted to directly purchasing stolen bodies, but the unspoken understanding was clear. The medical colleges, in their pursuit of knowledge, created a powerful, lucrative market for those willing to brave the depths of human fear and desecrate the dead. A common historical fact is that medical schools often turned a blind eye to the illicit origins of their cadavers, or even implicitly encouraged their acquisition, due to the severe lack of legal alternatives. This complicity, while ethically questionable, was born out of a genuine belief in the necessity of anatomical study for medical advancement. Consider the chilling logic. A cadaver that might only fetch a few dollars if sold as a curiosity could command a significant sum, perhaps $10 to $30. A considerable sum in the 19th century when sold to a desperate medical institution. This financial incentive was a powerful lure for those on the fringes of society, the impoverished, the desperate, and the morally flexible. It created a dark economy, where human remains became a commodity, stripped of their former dignity and reduced to mere anatomical specimens. You occasionally see notices in the local papers, advertisements for public lectures on anatomy, or demonstrations by visiting surgeons. These highlight the excitement and public interest in medical progress. Yet, beneath this veneer of scientific enlightenment, a chilling truth persisted. The foundations of this progress were often built upon desecrated graves. It's a stark reminder of the often uncomfortable truths hidden within historical advancement. One particular, less-known detail about this demand was the preference for certain types of bodies. Young, healthy cadavers, especially those with minimal scarring or deformities, were highly prized, as they offered the clearest and most normal anatomical specimens for study. This meant that recently deceased individuals, particularly those who died suddenly or from non-deforming illnesses, were prime targets. This created an even greater sense of dread for families, knowing that even a swift, natural death might not guarantee peace for their loved ones. Historians still debate the extent to which medical professionals were directly involved in the act of body snatching versus simply being passive recipients of the stolen goods. While most reputable doctors would never personally wield a shovel in a graveyard, the high prices they were willing to pay, and the lack of legal inquiry into the origins of the bodies, certainly fueled the macabre trade. This creates a fascinating ethical gray area, where scientific progress and moral compromise intertwined. Imagine you're walking through the bustling streets of Philadelphia. You might pass by the imposing red brick buildings of the medical colleges, their windows often dark and seemingly innocuous. Yet you know that within those walls, secrets are kept, and lessons are learned from bodies acquired through the most unsettling means. The demand for cadavers wasn't just a whisper in the night. It was the very pulse of anatomical science, beating with a macabre rhythm. The grim reality of this demand permeated society. Families who could afford it often hired watchmen to guard graves or even built elaborate contraptions to deter grave robbers. The fear was pervasive, a testament to the community's desperate attempts to protect the sanctity of their dead from the insatiable hunger of the dissecting table. This era highlights a painful paradox. The advancement of life-saving knowledge often came at the cost of profound disrespect for the deceased, a chilling reminder of the ethical complexities hidden within the pursuit of scientific progress. And as you imagine the quiet city streets, you can almost hear the faint, distant hum of the medical college, a place of learning built, in part on the uneasy silence of stolen graves. In the chilling drama of 19th century grave robbing, the actors were a grim assortment, collectively known as resurrection men. These weren't typically hardened criminals in the conventional sense, but rather individuals often desperate, impoverished, and driven by the significant sums offered by medical schools who undertook the macabre task of exhuming the dead. Imagine yourself in the dimly lit labyrinthine alleyways of Baltimore, a city with several prominent medical institutions. You might be a struggling laborer, a former sailor down on his luck, or simply someone who has fallen through the cracks of polite society. The prospect of a quick, albeit dangerous, payday from stealing a body could be too tempting to resist in an era without a social safety net. These individuals operated under the cloak of deepest night, usually in small, tight-knit groups, often a pair or a trio. Each member had a specific role. One might be the lookout, another the digger, and a third responsible for swiftly removing the body. They were often surprisingly skilled at their gruesome trade, possessing an intimate knowledge of local cemeteries, burial customs, and the telltale signs of a fresh grave. They knew which parts of a cemetery were least patrolled, which graves were likely to be unguarded, and how to work quickly and silently to avoid detection. You might hear hushed stories circulating among the city's underbelly about these characters. Tales of their crude humor, their heavy drinking, and their utter lack of remorse for their nocturnal activities. They were figures of fear and fascination, operating in the moral shadows, providing a necessary but abominable service to the advancing world of medicine. Their lives were fraught with danger, not just from angry mobs or law enforcement, but from the very nature of their work, the constant exposure to death. The psychological toll of violating sacred ground. A common historical fact is that resurrection men often worked in highly organized gangs, sometimes even forming tacit agreements with local authorities or medical schools to ensure a steady, if illegal, supply of bodies. This organization helped them to operate efficiently and evade capture for extended periods. Their efficiency was chilling. They rarely dug up the entire grave, a time-consuming and noisy endeavor. Instead, they would often dig down at the head end of the coffin, levering the lid open just enough to pull the body out. This minimized the disturbance to the grave, making it harder for casual observers to detect the theft. They would then quickly refill the grave, making it appear untouched, leaving only the faintest signs of their nocturnal visit. One particularly grim, yet fascinating detail about these individuals was their practical knowledge of decomposition. They preferred recently buried bodies, as these were in the best condition for anatomical study. They knew that bodies buried for too long would begin to decompose, rendering them less useful for dissection. This meant they had to act quickly after a burial, often targeting graves that were only a few days old, heightening the urgency and risk of their operations. Historians still debate the social origins of the resurrection men. Were they exclusively drawn from the poorest classes, driven by sheer economic desperation? Or did some come from more skilled backgrounds? Perhaps former gravediggers or laborers with a specialized knowledge of excavation. While poverty was undoubtedly a major factor, the specialized skills required suggest that not just anyone could become an effective body snatcher. Imagine you're walking through a graveyard in the early morning hours. Perhaps visiting a loved one's fresh grave? The grass still appears somewhat disturbed from the recent burial, but nothing overtly seems wrong. Yet, a trained eye, or a grieving family member with a gnawing suspicion, might notice a subtle difference in the soil, a slightly uneven patch, or a tiny footprint where there shouldn't be one. These were the ghostly calling cards of the resurrection men, subtle signs that a grave had been plundered. The public's fear of these individuals was immense. They were seen as moral monsters, preying on the most vulnerable and violating the sanctity of death. Newspapers often sensationalized their exploits, fueling public outrage and leading to occasional vigilante justice. If a body snatcher was caught by an angry mob, the consequences could be brutal and immediate, far more severe than any legal punishment. This fear would, however, rarely deterred the trade, as the demand for bodies remained high, ensuring a continuous supply of desperate individuals willing to take the risk. Consider the psychological toll on these men. While they might appear callous and hardened, the constant interaction with death, the moral compromises, and the ever-present danger must have left their mark. There's a dark irony in their profession contributing to the advancement of life-saving medicine by desecrating the bodies of the recently deceased. They were the unsung and utterly uncelebrated, facilitators of anatomical knowledge, their names lost to history, their legacy etched in the fear they inspired and the progress they inadvertently enabled. And as you try to drift off to sleep, you might just hear the distant scrape of a shovel and the chilling silence of a freshly plundered grave. To avoid detection, the resurrection men developed a fascinating array of specialized tools and techniques, each one designed for speed, stealth, and efficiency. Imagine yourself a member of such a crew, perhaps in a large, bustling city like New York City in the 1840s. The city's sprawling network of cemeteries, from the crowded churchyards of Manhattan to the newer, more rural burial grounds of Brooklyn, offered ample opportunity for their grim work. You're not just digging, you're performing a macabre ballet under the cover of darkness. Their primary tool was not the typical shovel you might imagine, but often a specially modified one, shorter handled and sometimes with a slightly narrower blade, making it easier to maneuver in tight spaces and less conspicuous to carry. Alongside this, they carried spades, crowbars for prying, and a length of sturdy rope with a hook. A dark lantern, its light carefully shielded, provided just enough illumination to work by, without casting telltale glows that might alert watchmen or curious passers-by. They also often carried burlap sacks or large rough wooden boxes, discrete containers for their illicit cargo. The process itself was a chilling testament to their efficiency. They rarely dug up the entire grave. To do so would be too time-consuming, too noisy, and would leave too obvious a sign of disturbance. Instead, they focused on minimizing their time at the site. They would typically dig down at the head end of the coffin, directly above where the body's head would be. This was the narrowest part of the grave to excavate, requiring less soil to be removed. Once they had dug down to the coffin lid, they would use their crowbars to pry it open. This was a critical, delicate moment. The sound of splintering wood could carry in the still night air. They needed to create just enough of an opening, often only at the head end, to access the body. Then, using the hooked rope, they would lasso the corpse, pulling it up and out of the coffin, often stripping it of its burial shroud and clothes to avoid implicating themselves with stolen property, which carried a heavier penalty than body snatching itself. The empty coffin would be left behind, often undisturbed save for the pried lid. A common historical fact is that body snatchers were usually careful to leave the deceased's clothing and valuables in the coffin. As stealing these items constituted a more serious crime theft than merely taking the body itself, which was often only a misdemeanor or not explicitly illegal in many places. This legal loophole was a grim advantage for them. The speed with which they operated was legendary. A skilled team could exhume a body in under an hour, sometimes even as quickly as 15 or 20 minutes. From the initial dig to the grave's refilling, they would then carefully replace the disturbed soil, often stomping it down or even using layers of grass and turf to make the grave appear as undisturbed as possible. The goal was to leave no trace, or at least no obvious trace that would immediately alarm visiting family members in the morning. You might imagine the grave robbers of legend as crude, bumbling figures, but in reality, they were often cunning and precise. They studied the habits of grave diggers, knowing how fresh soil settled and how to replicate the look of an untouched burial plot. They often carried water with them to wet the soil, helping it compact and blend more naturally with the surrounding earth. It was a macabre artistry, a perverse application of skill to a horrifying task. One less-known detail about their methods involved dealing with grave markers. If a large, heavy tombstone stood directly over the grave, making access difficult, the Snatchers would sometimes carefully pry it up using levers and rollers, moving it just enough to dig underneath, and then meticulously replacing it to conceal their work. This level of effort speaks to the high value placed on fresh cadavers. Historians still debate the specific tricks of the trade that were most effective for body snatchers. Was it their speed, their knowledge of legal loopholes, or their ability to blend into the shadows of society that made them so successful at evading capture? It was likely a combination of these factors, adapting to local conditions and laws. Imagine you're standing watch for your crew in a quiet, sprawling cemetery on the outskirts of Boston. The air is cold, and the only sounds are the rustle of leaves and the distant hoot of an owl. You scan the horizon, your eyes peeled for the glimmer of a lantern or the silhouette of a passing watchman. Your heart pounds with a mix of fear and adrenaline. You know the consequences of being caught a beating, imprisonment, public shaming. But the thought of the payment, enough to feed your family for weeks, pushes you forward. The body snatchers were also masters of disguise and diversion. They might travel to cemeteries dressed as laborers or farmers, carrying their tools disguised as gardening implements. They would often choose nights with poor visibility, moonless nights, or those shrouded in fog or heavy rain, as these conditions provided natural cover for their operations. They might even create small distractions, like setting off a loud noise in one part of the cemetery to draw attention away from their true target. The public's fear, fueled by newspaper accounts and local gossip, meant that people developed an acute awareness of disturbed graves. A slightly sunken patch of earth, a displaced flower, or a faint, unsettling scent could immediately trigger alarm. This forced body snatchers to become even more meticulous in their concealment, constantly refining their methods to stay one step ahead of a terrified populace. The macabre ingenuity of these resurrection men stands as a dark testament to human resourcefulness, even in the service of grim deeds. Their disturbing world, defined by clandestine operations and chilling efficiency, served as the hidden engine for the advancement of medical science, leaving behind a legacy of fear and a chilling reminder of how desperate times could breed truly desperate and horrifying professions. And as you finally drift off to sleep, you might find yourself picturing a shovel, digging silently in the dead of night, leaving behind nothing but the faint whisper of disturbed earth. Once a body was snatched from its grave, it embarked on a clandestine, often horrifying journey from the quiet darkness of the cemetery to the brightly lit, yet equally grim, dissection tables of the medical college. Imagine yourself as one of the resurrection men in Philadelphia, the heart of early American medicine, guiding your illicit cargo through the city's labyrinthine streets in the dead of night. Every shadow seems to hold a potential threat, every distant sound a sign of discovery. The first step was the immediate removal of the body from the graveyard. Speed was paramount. Once the corpse was exhumed, it was often stripped of its burial shroud and clothes at the graveside. This wasn't just about avoiding a more severe charge of theft. It was also practical. Clothing could be bulky, dirty, and might carry identifying marks. The body, often wrapped in a simple canvas or burlap sack, was then quickly loaded onto a waiting conveyance. This could be anything from a crude handcart to a horse-drawn buggy, its wheels muffled with rags to minimize noise. The route taken from the cemetery was carefully planned, avoiding main thoroughfares and police patrols, sticking to dark alleyways and deserted side streets. The journey itself was fraught with peril. Public sentiment against grave robbing was fiercely strong, fueled by fear and outrage. If caught by an angry mob, the consequences for a body snatcher could be brutal and immediate, often involving severe beatings or even lynching, far worse than any legal punishment. Even encounters with watchmen or police, while less violent, meant arrest, fines, and potentially imprisonment, ending a lucrative operation. The cold sweat of fear was a constant companion on these nocturnal deliveries. A common historical fact is that the resurrection men often transported bodies in disguise, using covered carts or even carrying them in large baskets labeled produce or meat to avoid suspicion. This was a desperate attempt to blend into the city's nocturnal landscape. The destination was always a medical college, but never through the front door. These institutions, while desperate for bodies, maintained a facade of respectability. Deliveries were made to secluded back entrances, often after midnight, where a waiting agent from the college, usually a junior professor or a laboratory assistant, would discreetly receive the grim cargo. The transaction was swift and silent. Cash exchanged hands. The body was quickly whisked inside, and the resurrection men vanished back into the shadows, leaving no trace of their visit. One peculiar detail you might notice is the method of payment. While cash was king, some medical schools, especially those with particularly pressing needs, would sometimes offer a bonus of valuable medical instruments or rare anatomical techs to their most reliable suppliers. This further incentivized the grave robbers, creating a symbiotic, albeit illicit, relationship between the academic world and the criminal underworld. The quality of the body was also crucial. A body that was too decomposed or too damaged during excavation would fetch a lower price or might even be rejected. This forced the grave robbers to be meticulous in their work, ensuring the body arrived in the best possible condition for dissection. It was a grim quality control system, driven by the demands of anatomical study. Historians still debate the extent of direct communication between body snatchers and medical faculty. While direct orders for specific bodies were unlikely, there was certainly an understanding of the types of bodies preferred fresh, healthy, sometimes even specific ailments for pathological study that would guide the grave robbers' targets. This created a macabre form of market research. Imagine the scene within the medical college once the body was received. It would be quickly moved to the dissecting room, often stored in a cellar or a cool, isolated chamber until needed. Preservatives, usually arsenic-based solutions or alcohol, would be injected into the cadaver to slow decomposition and make it suitable for prolonged study. These fluids, while essential, would often give the dissecting rooms a distinct, somewhat unsettling odor. For the medical students, the arrival of a new cadaver was a moment of intense excitement and opportunity. It meant hands-on learning, the chance to finally apply theoretical knowledge to the tangible reality of the human form. For them, the macabre journey of the body was largely irrelevant. Its scientific value was paramount. They were driven by the thirst for knowledge, often oblivious or willfully ignorant of the dark means by which that knowledge was acquired. The entire process, from grave to dissection table, highlights the profound ethical compromises made in the name of scientific progress during this era. The desperate need for anatomical knowledge created a market that exploited the vulnerabilities of society: the poor, the unguarded, the recently deceased. The black market cadaver was more than just a body. It was a symbol of a disturbing period in medical history, where the pursuit of life-saving knowledge often trampled upon the sanctity of human dignity. And as you try to drift off to sleep tonight, you might imagine the silent passage of a shrouded form, vanishing into the secret entrance of a grand building, forever transformed from a person into a specimen. The insatiable demand for cadavers wasn't just a grim reality for the resurrection men. It presented a profound moral dilemma for the very institutions that drove the trade, the burgeoning medical schools, and the eager physicians within them. Imagine yourself as a conscientious medical student or a young doctor in Boston during the mid-19th century. You're driven by a genuine desire to heal, to understand the intricate workings of the human body, and to advance the frontiers of medicine. Yet, the foundation of this noble pursuit, anatomical dissection, often rested on a deeply disturbing, ethically dubious practice. The paradox was stark. You couldn't become a competent doctor without hands-on experience, and that experience required cadavers. Without a reliable legal supply, the only recourse was the illicit market. This forced medical professionals into a difficult position. They weren't directly wielding shovels in graveyards, but they were the end buyers, providing the financial incentive that fueled the entire macabre enterprise. The silence and implicit acceptance of the origins of these bodies created a complex web of complicity. Professors would often speak in veiled terms about their anatomical material, avoiding any direct mention of grave robbing. Yet the students, eager to learn, were well aware of the rumors and the nocturnal arrivals at the dissecting room's back entrance. The smell of chloride of lime, used to mask the scent of decomposition and disinfect the rooms, became synonymous with the clandestine acquisition of bodies. It was a constant, unsettling reminder of the moral tightrope everyone in the medical community was walking. A common historical fact is that many prominent medical figures of the 19th century, while condemning grave robbing publicly, privately acknowledged its necessity for medical education. They faced a genuine dilemma: compromise their ethics or compromise the quality of their students' training, ultimately hindering medical progress. The ethical arguments within the medical community were complex and often contradictory. Some argued for the greater good, asserting that individual desecration was a small price to pay for the advancement of public health and the saving of countless lives in the future. They believed that denying students access to cadavers would lead to poorly trained doctors, ultimately causing more harm. Others can, however, wrestled with their consciences. Troubled by the violation of human dignity and the widespread public outrage, you might overhear hushed, heated debates among your more morally sensitive colleagues. Who aim to preserve life, be complicit in such disrespect for the dead? One might argue, another might counter. And how can we save lives if we do not truly understand the body? Are the lives of the living not worth more than the disturbed rest of the dead? There were no easy answers, and the arguments often ended in frustrated silence, the weight of the dilemma pressing heavily on all involved. One peculiar, less-known aspect of this moral quandary was the practice of some anatomists in Europe, who, when faced with extreme scarcity, would resort to dissecting the bodies of their own family members or close friends who had explicitly given permission before death. While this was rare and legally tenuous, it highlights the extreme lengths some were willing to go to acquire anatomical specimens, demonstrating the depth of the scientific demand even without resorting to grave robbing. Historians still debate the long-term impact of this ethical compromise on the medical profession's public image. While medicine eventually gained immense respect, the legacy of body snatching certainly cast a dark shadow for decades, contributing to public mistrust of doctors and hospitals. The fear of public exposure was very real for medical institutions. Several infamous riots erupted across the United States in response to discovered body snatching operations. Most notably the Doctors' Riot in New York City in 1788, which, though earlier, set a precedent for public outrage. Medical colleges often faced angry mobs, demanding investigations and the punishment of those involved. This constant threat forced institutions to maintain a strict veil of secrecy around their cadaver supply, further contributing to the illicit nature of the trade. Imagine a night when rumors sweep through Boston that a body from a prominent family was found missing from a local cemetery, and it's believed to have ended up at a particular medical college. The streets outside the institution swell with an angry crowd, their shouts echoing off the brick buildings. You, perhaps inside, hear the roar, the shattering of glass, the heavy thud of stones against the walls. The sense of dread is palpable. you know that lives could be at stake. Both those of the medical students trapped inside and those of the protesters outside. This was the volatile intersection where scientific progress collided violently with public morality. The moral dilemma also extended to the students themselves. They were learning valuable, life-saving skills, but they were doing so at the expense of another's dignity. Some undoubtedly became desensitized, viewing the cadavers purely as specimens. Others might have felt a nagging unease, a quiet guilt, even as they plunged their scalpels into the cold flesh. This constant exposure to the morally ambiguous could not have been without its psychological toll. Ultimately, the disturbing ethical tightrope walked by 19th century medicine was a reflection of a society struggling to reconcile scientific ambition with deeply ingrained cultural and religious beliefs. The intense demand for cadavers, coupled with the lack of legal alternatives, created a dark market that tested the moral boundaries of even the most well-intentioned individuals. It's a stark reminder that progress, especially in its early stages, often comes with unforeseen and uncomfortable ethical costs, leaving behind a complex legacy of both advancement and moral compromise. And as you consider this dark chapter, you might feel a shiver, realizing the profound sacrifices, both seen and unseen, that paved the way for modern medicine. The pervasive fear of grave robbery wasn't just a distant threat in 19th century America. It was a deeply personal terror that led ordinary people to take extraordinary, sometimes macabre, measures to protect their loved ones' graves. Imagine yourself in rural Pennsylvania in the 1850s. The news of a local grave desecration spreads like wildfire through your small community, shattering the peace and instilling a chilling dread. You've just laid a family member to rest now. The thought of their eternal sleep being disturbed by the resurrection men becomes a horrifying obsession. For those with means, the most effective, albeit expensive method was the mort safe. These were heavy iron cages or stone slabs placed over a freshly dug grave, designed to deter even the most determined body snatcher. Think of it as a fortified vault for the deceased. Some were elaborate iron frameworks, resembling giant bird cages that would be lowered over the coffin itself, making it impossible to dig down to. Others were massive, intricately designed stone slabs, sometimes with embedded iron bars, requiring immense effort and specialized tools to move. These were rented out by sextons or enterprising individuals, often for a period of several weeks or months, until the body was sufficiently decomposed to be of no use to anatomists, or until the family felt the immediate threat had passed. You might see these grim structures in local cemeteries, their dark iron silhouettes standing out against the lighter gravestones. They were a stark, visible symbol of the community's fear and their desperate attempts to protect the sanctity of their dead. They also served as a chilling reminder of the very real threat lurking in the shadows. For families of more modest means, communal grave watching became a widespread, yet exhausting practice. After a burial, family members and friends would take turns guarding the grave, often for several nights in a row. Imagine huddling by a fresh grave in the bitter cold of a winter night, a dim lantern casting flickering shadows, your eyes strained, listening intently for the faintest sound, a distant shovel scraping, a muffled whisper, the rustle of leaves that isn't just the wind. Fear and exhaustion would battle within you as the silence of the cemetery played tricks on your mind. This constant vigilance speaks volumes about the depth of terror instilled by the body snatchers. A common historical fact is that families would often organize vigils at gravesides, sometimes for weeks after a burial, to deter grave robbers, especially after a prominent burial or during periods of increased body snatching activity. These grave watches highlight the community's collective effort against this macabre threat. Beyond the mort safes and grave watches, people employed various ingenious, sometimes bizarre methods to protect their loved ones. Some graves were filled with rocks and thorny bushes, making excavation incredibly difficult and painful. Others laid planks of wood or heavy stones over the coffin before filling in the soil, hoping to create an impenetrable barrier. There were even reports of families embedding loaded firearms within the grave, rigged to discharge if the coffin was disturbed. A desperate and dangerous measure to ensure the eternal rest of their dead. One particularly peculiar, less-known detail was the use of coffin torpedoes. These were spring-loaded devices, essentially small explosive charges, placed within the coffin itself. If the coffin lid was pried open, the device would detonate, potentially injuring or even killing the grave robber. While it's debated how widespread their actual use was, the very concept of a coffin torpedo illustrates the extreme paranoia and desperation that gripped communities. The thought of a body-snatching operation turning into a literal explosion must have been a terrifying deterrent. Historians still debate the overall effectiveness of these protective measures. While mort safes and persistent grave watches certainly deterred some body snatchers, the most determined and organized gangs often found ways around them, demonstrating the powerful economic incentive driving the illicit trade. Imagine the sense of relief when the prescribed period of grave watching was over, or when the mort safe was finally removed. It was a moment of quiet triumph, a feeling that you had successfully defended your loved one's final resting place against a horrifying violation. But even then, a lingering unease often remained, a chilling memory of the night spent listening for shadows, a testament to the lasting psychological impact of the grave robber's threat. This era of body snatching forced communities to confront the fragility of peace, even in death. It spawned a grim ingenuity in grave protection, driven by deep-seated fears and a profound respect for the departed. The disturbing world of the body snatchers, while fleeting in the grand sweep of history, left an indelible mark on burial practices and cemented a pervasive sense of vulnerability that lingered long after the trade itself faded. And as you prepare for sleep, you might find yourself feeling a peculiar gratitude for the undisturbed quiet of modern cemeteries. A peace hard won by the anxieties of generations past. The disturbing reality of body snatching, though largely hidden in the shadows, inevitably surfaced in the public consciousness, leading to widespread fear and outcry that gripped communities across America. Imagine you are a newspaper editor in Philadelphia in the 1830s, and every few weeks another sensational report lands on your desk: a disturbed grave, a missing body, a grieving family's desperate plea for justice. Your presses roll, spreading the grim news, and with each headline, the public's outrage intensifies. The fear was primal and deeply rooted. For centuries, the sanctity of burial was paramount, offering a final resting place for loved ones and a spiritual passage for the deceased. Grave robbing shattered this sacred peace, violating profound religious beliefs and cultural norms. The idea that a loved one's body, once interred, could be dug up, dissected, and treated as mere scientific material was an affront to human dignity that transcended social class. It didn't matter if you were rich or poor, the threat loomed over every family. Newspapers, while sometimes sensationalizing the reports, also served as a crucial outlet for public anger. Editorials would denounce the ghoulish trade and castigate the medical institutions for their perceived complicity. Letters to the editor, often penned by terrified or heartbroken citizens, demanded action from authorities. The sheer volume of these protests created immense pressure on city officials, police, and even the medical community itself. A common historical fact is that public outrage over body snatching often led to riots and mob violence, particularly when a suspected body snatcher was caught or when evidence pointed to a specific medical institution. These resurrection riots, though less frequent than individual acts of grave robbing, were dramatic expressions of collective fury. One particularly notorious incident that would have fueled such outrage was the Doctors' Riot in New York City in 1788, though it predates our specific timeline. Its memory and lessons profoundly influenced later public reactions. While specific to New York, similar, albeit smaller, incidents of public unrest and even violence against medical students or institutions occurred in other cities, like Philadelphia and Baltimore, whenever a body-snatching ring was exposed. These weren't isolated acts of vandalism. They were a community's desperate attempt to reclaim control over the sacred boundary between life and death. You might witness firsthand the immediate aftermath of such an event. A crowd gathers outside a medical college, their faces contorted with rage, shouting slogans like "No more murdered bodies" or "Respect the dead." Stones might fly, windows shatter, and the police struggle to maintain order. The fear of contagion, both physical and moral, was also a factor. People worried about disease spreading from disturbed graves, and they feared the moral decay that such a trade represented. A less-known detail is that sometimes, even clergy members would join the public outcry, delivering impassioned sermons against the desecration of graves, reinforcing the spiritual and moral abhorrence of the practice. Their condemnation lent significant weight to the public's demands for legal and ethical reform. This added another layer of authority to the public's protest, making it harder for medical institutions to simply dismiss the concerns. Historians still debate whether the widespread public outcry was more effective at curbing body snatching than legislative efforts. While laws were eventually passed, the immediate, visceral reaction of a terrified populace often had a more direct and immediate impact on deterring the trade. The public's fear also led to suspicion. Any sudden, unexplained wealth acquired by individuals from the poorer districts, or any unusual activity around cemeteries would draw sharp scrutiny. Unmarked wagons seen late at night, or strangers lingering near burial grounds, could spark immediate alarm and investigation by concerned citizens. Neighborhoods organized their own patrols, forming vigilante groups to watch over their local cemeteries, demonstrating the grassroots response to a threat that official channels often struggled to contain. Imagine the pervasive unease that settled over a town or city during a period of active body snatching. Every funeral, every new grave, was accompanied by a gnawing anxiety. Families would gather, not just to mourn, but to discuss protective measures, to share rumors, and to warn each other. The sense of vulnerability was profound, a constant reminder that even in death, one was not safe from the dark demands of science. This widespread fear also led to an increased demand for the aforementioned mort safes and other grave protection devices. Becoming a visible manifestation of public terror, the relentless public outcry, fueled by a deep-seated respect for the dead and a profound sense of violation, ultimately became a powerful force for change. It pressured legislatures to enact new laws, forced medical schools to seek alternative legal sources of cadavers, and slowly, painstakingly, helped to shift the ethical landscape of medical education. The disturbing world of the body snatchers may have existed in the shadows, but the public's roaring response brought it into the light, forcing a reckoning between scientific progress and human dignity. And as you finally drift off to sleep, you might feel a peculiar calm, knowing that the protests of generations past ultimately secured the peace of the grave, allowing the dead to truly rest undisturbed. The relentless public outcry, combined with the increasing audacity of the body snatchers, slowly but surely forced a response from the legal system. However, the path to effective legislation was often protracted and fraught with challenges, leaving a period of legislative shadows where laws were either insufficient or poorly enforced. Imagine you are a legislator in Massachusetts in the 1840s, wrestling with petitions from horrified constituents, demands from medical schools, and the complex legal precedents surrounding the sanctity of the grave. Initially, many states had no specific laws against body snatching itself. The act was often prosecuted under broader statutes related to disturbing the peace, trespassing, or even petty theft. Though body snatchers carefully avoided taking clothing or valuables to evade these heavier charges. The penalties were typically light small fines or short jail sentences, hardly a deterrent for a trade that offered significant financial rewards. This legal vacuum was precisely what allowed the macabre business to flourish. The challenge for lawmakers was multifaceted. On one hand, there was immense public pressure to crack down on grave desecration and protect the dead. On the other, medical professionals, including highly respected doctors and educators, lobbied tirelessly for access to cadavers, arguing that their work was essential for public health and scientific advancement. They often argued that stricter anti-snatching laws, without a legal alternative, would cripple medical education and lead to untrained physicians. A common historical fact is that early laws against body snatching were often vague and difficult to enforce, reflecting the legal system's struggle to categorize a crime that violated social norms more than established property rights. Since a body was not considered property in the traditional sense, theft laws often didn't directly apply. You might witness heated debates in the state legislature. Some politicians, driven by moral outrage or public pressure, would propose harsh penalties for grave robbers. Others, perhaps swayed by the arguments of medical lobbyists or concerned about the state of medical education, would push for more lenient approaches or argue for the need for anatomy acts that would provide legal sources of bodies. The legislative process was slow, often lagging behind the rapid advancements in medical science and the escalating problem of body snatching. One less-known detail about these early legislative efforts was the concept of charitable anatomy acts. These laws, when passed, often allowed for the dissection of unclaimed bodies from prisons, almshouses, or public hospitals. While a step towards a legal supply, these acts still disproportionately affected the poor and marginalized, raising new ethical concerns about who bore the burden of scientific progress. This perpetuated a form of social inequality, where the bodies of the indigent were deemed acceptable for dissection, while the privileged could rest undisturbed. Historians still debate whether legislative reforms were truly effective in eradicating body snatching, or if the trade simply went further underground and diminished only when legal anatomical supply eventually caught up with demand. While laws certainly helped, the economic incentive for body snatchers remained strong until a consistent, legal alternative was firmly established. Imagine the frustration of a sheriff in a rural town, tasked with investigating a grave robbery. Without specific laws or with weak ones, his hands might be tied. Even if a suspect was apprehended, proving the crime and securing a conviction was challenging. The grave robbers were cunning, often leaving minimal evidence, and sometimes even had sympathetic contacts within the justice system who might turn a blind eye for a price. The very act of digging up a body was seen as repugnant, but proving intent and navigating the legal ambiguities was a constant struggle for law enforcement. The public's lack of trust in the legal system's ability to protect their dead often fueled their vigilante actions, leading to the grave watches and mort safes we discussed earlier. This grassroots protection was a direct response to the perceived inadequacy of legal safeguards, a testament to the community's determination to take matters into their own hands when the law fell short. Eventually, as the 19th century progressed, and particularly in the latter half, more comprehensive anatomy acts began to be passed across various states. These acts aimed to create a legal framework for supplying medical schools with cadavers, typically from unclaimed bodies in public institutions. Massachusetts, for example, passed its own Anatomy Act, providing a more reliable, if ethically still debated, source. These laws, though slow to come, were crucial in slowly diminishing the demand for illegally obtained bodies. The disturbing era of body snatching highlights a fundamental tension in society, the balance between scientific advancement and ethical boundaries. The legislative shadows of the 19th century, where laws struggled to catch up with a rapidly evolving medical field and a chilling illicit trade, served as a painful lesson. It demonstrated that true societal progress requires not just scientific breakthroughs, but also the establishment of clear, enforceable ethical guidelines that uphold human dignity, even in death. And as you drift off to sleep, you might feel a peculiar comfort in the modern legal protections surrounding cemeteries, a peace forged in the long, drawn-out battle against the macabre shadows of the past. The disturbing era of body snatching, a dark chapter born from the collision of scientific ambition and societal ethics, ultimately left an enduring legacy that shaped both anatomical study and burial practices in profound ways. As you reflect on this grim period, perhaps sitting in a quiet, modern cemetery in, say, rural Ohio, you can trace the faint echoes of 19th century anxieties in the way we regard death and the dead today. a testament to how past struggles for peace can resonate through the generations. The most direct and significant legacy was the eventual legalization of cadaver supply for medical schools. For decades, the clandestine dance between medical institutions and the resurrection men persisted because there was simply no viable alternative. Medical students, driven by a thirst for knowledge and a desperate need for hands-on experience, were effectively trapped in a system that demanded unethical sourcing. But the sustained public outcry, fueled by a visceral fear and a profound sense of violation, coupled with the increasing audacity and violence associated with grave robbing, finally compelled legislatures across the United States to act. They were faced with an undeniable dilemma: either cripple the burgeoning medical profession or find a legal, if imperfect, pathway for anatomical study. This pressure led to the passage of comprehensive anatomy acts. These laws, which varied slightly from state to state, typically allowed for the dissection of unclaimed bodies, primarily those of individuals who died in public institutions such as almshouses, prisons, and public hospitals, and whose bodies were not claimed by family members within a specified time frame. While ethically imperfect, as it still disproportionately affected the poor and marginalized, making their bodies the acceptable sacrifice for scientific progress, it provided a consistent legal alternative to grave robbing. This shift fundamentally altered the landscape of medical education. No longer did medical schools need to deal with shadowy figures and muffled wagons arriving in the dead of night. They could acquire their anatomical material through formal, albeit somber, channels. This allowed anatomical study to flourish openly and without the constant specter of criminal activity and public outrage. The clandestine operations of the resurrection men slowly withered away as their grim services became redundant, their macabre market drying up under the light of legal reform. The constant, chilling dread that a loved one's grave might be disturbed began to recede from the public consciousness, replaced by a fragile, hard-won sense of security. Beyond the legal changes, the era of body snatching profoundly impacted burial practices and cemetery design. The widespread fear instilled in communities led to an almost desperate ingenuity in grave protection. Measures that, while initially born of raw terror, left a lasting mark on how we lay our dead to rest. The use of mort safes, those heavy iron cages or stone slabs placed over fresh graves, became a common sight in cemeteries, especially in urban areas and during peak snatching periods. These were grim sentinels, physically safeguarding the deceased from desecration. Families, regardless of their social standing, invested in stronger coffins, sometimes even adding internal locks or multiple layers of protective stone and concrete above the coffin. The design of tombs and mausoleums became more robust, not just for grandeur, but for security against intrusion, even for those who couldn't afford elaborate protections. The practice of grave watching became deeply ingrained. Communities organized rotating vigils, families huddled by fresh graves for weeks on end, listening for the telltale sounds of shovels or hushed voices in the darkness. While these direct physical protections and watches largely faded with the decline of body snatching, the psychological legacy persisted, subtly influencing the perceived need for secure, well-maintained cemeteries. The very idea of a peaceful, undisturbed rest for the dead became a cornerstone of cultural belief, reinforced by generations who had personally battled against its violation. You can still see this legacy in the enduring cultural emphasis on the sanctity of the grave. Even today, while the threat of body snatching is a distant historical curiosity, the idea of disturbing a grave remains deeply taboo and legally protected with stringent laws. This societal reverence for the resting place of the dead was intensely forged and amplified by the horrors of the 19th century, cementing a collective understanding that once interred, the deceased should remain undisturbed. The silence of modern cemeteries, the peace that settles over them, is a testament to battles fought and won by a terrified populace. A peculiar, less-known legacy is how the medical profession, in the wake of the body-snatching scandals, embarked on a long, arduous process of rebuilding public trust. For decades, medicine had been tainted by its association with grave robbing, Doctors and medical institutions consciously work to distance themselves from the illicit practices of the past, emphasizing ethical conduct, patient care, and transparency. This involved not just strict adherence to the new Anatomy Acts, but also a concerted effort to educate the public about the importance of anatomical donation for scientific advancement, encouraging voluntary contributions rather than reliance on unclaimed bodies. This gradual shift helped to establish a more benevolent and trustworthy image for medicine, one built on a foundation of ethical practice and public service, rather than shadowy dealings. Historians still debate the extent to which the pervasive fear of body snatching contributed to the rise of embalming practices. While the widespread adoption of embalming in the United States gained momentum during the Civil War for practical reasons preserving bodies for transport home, some scholars argue that the desire to render bodies unsuitable for dissection, or to provide a more permanent, unalterable preservation against any form of disturbance, may have been a subtle contributing factor in its earlier growing acceptance. This makes you wonder about the subtle, often unforeseen ways historical anxieties can influence cultural practices and technological adoption. Imagine visiting an old, well-preserved cemetery today. You might notice the ornate ironwork around some of the older family plots, or the unusually thick stone slabs covering certain graves. These aren't just decorative elements, they are silent, tangible reminders of a time when vigilance was paramount, when families had to physically guard against the macabre demands of early medical science. The very design of modern cemeteries, with their focus on security, peace, and permanent, inviolable markers, owes a subtle but profound debt to the anxieties and struggles of the body-snatching era. The undisturbed quiet that blankets these solemn grounds is a testament to a peace hard-won by the anxieties of generations past, who fought to ensure that death truly meant rest. The disturbing world of body snatchers serves as a powerful historical lesson. It highlights the complex interplay between urgent scientific progress, deeply ingrained societal ethics, and the slow, often reactive development of legal frameworks. It reminds us that even noble pursuits, when unfettered by moral considerations or established legal pathways, can inadvertently create horrifying, exploitative industries. The fear and outrage of ordinary people, coupled with the eventual legislative reforms and the medical community's commitment to ethical conduct, ultimately paved the way for a more humane and legally sanctioned approach to anatomical study. This ensured that the dead could finally rest in peace, their bodies no longer commodities, but respected subjects of study, and that the sanctity of the grave, so deeply violated for a time, was eventually restored. And as you prepare for a peaceful night's sleep, you can find a quiet comfort in knowing that the legacy of those past struggles ensures the solemn, undisturbed slumber of all who lie beneath the earth.